Hello and welcome to GovTech Viewpoints. My name is Teri Takai and I'm excited to be here with you for another one of our fantastic podcasts. I'm joined by HP's Todd Gustafson for another interesting and informative conversation. Now, for those of you that haven't been with us before, each episode of GovTech Viewpoints explores one big question that's facing state and local government today as they adopt new generation technologies. So Todd and I are going to be breaking down the latest and greatest issues and the latest and greatest topics and talk about how it really impacts state, city, and county leaders. So Todd, always great to be here with you. And I love today's conversation because I think it's really late breaking news in some ways. I'm not sure that I'm hearing a lot of widespread discussion, but as you and I have talked, that widespread discussion is coming. So as we all know, the very large companies are on kind of a push to really build out more compute power. So we're seeing data centers go up, both in terms of our cloud providers wanting to make sure that they had the compute power. But really, we're hearing from our chip manufacturers. We have several activities that are going on all over the country, whether it's the federal government really looking at it or state governments looking at it as an economic development opportunity. But this is really impacting the availability components in the supply chain. So talk a little about what you're seeing in the industry and, how is this really impacting that kind of supply and demand?
Hi, everyone. Hi, Teri. I just came back from Washington, a few days in Washington, D.C., visiting government customers, and I spent a fair bit of time in Northern Virginia. And what's interesting is you drive around Northern Virginia is you drive by all these buildings under construction, massive buildings, and none of them have windows. And they are as big as you can possibly imagine. And all they are is data center build-outs in Northern Virginia to manage the cloud, right, and AI infrastructure. And so that's just a little microcosm of what's happening in the world, but it's happening, and we see it all today, right? We see companies like Google and Meta and Microsoft and AWS, et cetera, building out all these data centers. And the investment is not measured in $1 or $2 billion, but rather $100 billion, right? That's each one of these companies talking about that. And the impact of that is they need processors, they need GPUs, they need storage, they need memory, they need all this capacity in the marketplace. And the frank reality is that the industry hasn't spun up enough in terms of the underlying architecture. Think drives, think memory, and even our processor manufacturers are now building more memory into their silicon. So it's putting immense pressure on the supply chain and manufacturers. And this is a simple, like I remember back to business school, right? Simple supply and demand kind of question. When there's a lot of demand and not enough supply, prices rise. And we're seeing in the marketplace a massive increase in component level costs that I think our listeners are either very aware of or might want to start to consider, particularly public sector customers that are operating on fixed budgets.
Well, I think that there's also a challenge, as you say, Todd, is that everyone is in that budget cycle now, and they're budgeting based on pricing from before. But that pricing is going to be really volatile going forward, isn't it?
Well, and this is a comment more industry based, but the analogy I would draw it akin to is the price of gasoline or the price that you may pay at a seafood market. And at any given time, when you go in and you want to buy, like I live in Boston, we want to buy haddock. The price that we paid a month ago versus the price we pay today is going to be significantly different. It could be for a myriad of reasons. But to give you an example and give a finer point to it, a 16 gigabyte DIMM that you may have bought in October or November has gone up almost 500%. 500. percent, just one. And as you go up the stack, 32 gigabyte DIMM, 64, or if you're using ECC memory, error checking in ECC, I'm trying to remember what it, anyways, ECC memory, the cost is even greater. And so what I think is really important to think about is that not only do you have that memory, just pure, onboard memory, but then you have memory cost because of the processors are using memory. So their components are going up. And then solid state drives are also going up. And if I could, that if you think about whether it's drive manufacturers, there's about 3 drive manufacturers in the marketplace: Western Digital, Hynix, and Samsung. Those are the 3 major solid state drive manufacturers. In memory, you have ST Hynix, Micron, and Samsung as the primary memory manufacturers. They consume 90% of the marketplace. The problem is, in order for them to stand up fabs, in order to meet this demand, it's a 2+ year build out. And this bubble may burst by the time that potential investment would want to happen. And so the market's going to be faced with the stark reality of not enough supply, or not the supply that you may want, right? There may be enough supply in the marketplace, and a substantive cost increase. And we don't, the industry does not expect, right? If you go to Gartner or IDC or any other industry firm, is they're going to tell you that they would expect it to last through 2028. So think about it today. We're in February of 26, right? That we've got at least another year and a half of this going forward. And we would expect, as more and more data centers come online and as they build those out, the cost components, particularly through the end of this calendar year, are going to rise substantively. So there's some customers saying, I'll just wait it out, right? I'll wait it out. The problem is, if you're on a Windows 10 refresh, that may not be a good choice because of security considerations, as an example. But waiting it out there's not going to be any benefit to that in the industry. And I think some of our customers need to think about, are they putting the right configuration in? They may have to change their approach to navigate what you and I just talked about at the beginning of our conversation, which is around COVID. If you remember, during COVID, it wasn't perfect, right? But this is a super cycle, Teri and listeners. This is a super cycle that's much higher than the COVID super cycle, right? It's much more significant. It's much broader in terms of the impact in the market.
Well, this is also going to impact timing, right, Todd? So if we think about, for instance, there are still some locations that have data centers, and they have data center modernization plans. So it's not only the end user tech, but this is really going to start to cause delays as well, right, Todd, in terms of when I thought I was going to refresh and when I'm going to be able to refresh.
I think there'll be an element of that, but I also think you might have to make different choices that you've made. You likely may be able to get the supply that you need. However, it might be a lot more money, or you may have to think about deconstructing your configurations. In other words, if this was a PC or a server, you may say, I want to have 64 gigabytes on my system. The reality may be that you, because of cost considerations, can only do 32, but there'll be supply of that in the marketplace. The other thing, given that you brought up servers, right? If you think about it, server costs are based upon token usage, right? You go out, use a token, it costs you money. AWS or Google or Microsoft charges you a token, right? So you're seeing this escalating cost in terms of cloud-based costs that states and municipalities and governments are facing. Well, some of what advanced states and things are thinking about is, how do they bring that to the edge, right? So how do they bring AI, right, a machine that has a TOPS of 50 or greater, right? How do they bring that to the edge? Because your costs, if you bring it to the edge, are fixed, right? You have an asset that you've acquired, that cost is fixed. And if you do your AI locally, then that cost becomes fairly fixed as well, as opposed to pinging the cloud. But the reality is this is going to be a hybrid world, if you will. There'll be cloud-based needs, which will be absolutely the case. And then there should be, and organizations should start to pivot and say, how do I have a good edge strategy as well as cloud strategy?
Well, let's go to cloud, Todd. I mean, as you mentioned, the cloud providers are a part of, they're kind of the yin and yang. So they're building out data centers, but at the same token, it's costing them more actually to do those build outs. And so I think we're starting to see, I'm hearing actually some of that cost actually not necessarily being on hardware that state and city and county governments are buying, but rather actually in those cloud costs or from the various service providers.
Yeah, it reminds me of what my parents taught me very early in life. There's no such thing as a free lunch, right? And this is a classic example of that because their cost to serve is going up. And that cost to serve is going to naturally find its way to the user community in terms of increased cost as well. And while our company isn't involved in cloud-based architecture, the impact at the client versus the cloud is very similar in terms of its approach. There's a multiplier effect because a server costs more than a client, but nonetheless, it's the same. And so there's so many. I think about this like an old, like when I grew up. You had a receiver, and you had a lot of different knobs on that receiver to get the best possible sound output. Same kind of thing in IT, right? Is you have a lot of different knobs that you can dial, and I think this is a really important time that you navigate this through with your OEM to get the best possible outcome, because there likely will be an element of sticker shock that all of us are going to face here, particularly as we think about a lot of budgetary considerations end in June for folks, right, and which will likely be a very high point in the super cycle. And so organizations might start thinking about procuring early in the cycle as opposed to late in the cycle. And there's an element of cost of money as well, right? Because the cost of money, and I'm not a banker, but the cost of money today is cheaper than the cost of the rising cost of materials and goods in the marketplace. So there's a bigger picture to think about, and then you have all these different knobs. Make sure you take advantage of all those knobs, because what you may have thought was the best opportunity for you, the best solution, because of cost, might be rethought.
I love that, Todd, because when you think about this, the first kind of reaction I had was, well, this is about needing more money. But what you're really saying is that it's a combination of thinking about timing, thinking about what that increase might be, but then also thinking about how you configure your buy, if you will, differently, and you think of your architecture differently. And boy, I'll tell you, I love the part where you're talking about partnering, with your OEM, because that's a pretty complex set of knobs for most CIOs to really get their hands on and figure out how they may be changing their architecture.
It could be, but like industry does this for their day job, right? And OEMs can provide some paths, right? Or choice points. And then I encourage you to talk to other OEMs too, right? Because there might be, you may rethink your strategy altogether, right? But if I was to say one thing not to do is stick our head in the sand and think this is going to go away, because the frank reality is that it's here with us, much like COVID was with us for 2 years. This super cycle is going to be with us for at least another 18 plus months. And communication, engagement are key aspects in terms of how to navigate through this.
But let me take that one, Todd, because I think you talk with a lot of senior leaders. But sometimes, the CIOs and the technology folks have to figure out, how are they going to talk to their budget folks? How are they going to talk to their legislative body, whether it's a state legislature or whether it's county commission, whatever it is. So any tips or thoughts on how are you talking to policymakers so that, again, it's not a Chicken Little, but you're able to express to them that they need to be thinking about this?
So I think I grew up and I've continued to believe in my life that communication is the single most important asset that we have in life, right? That's number one. Number two is I've also learned that bad news never ages well. And so the importance of getting in front of what's happening in the marketplace. Number three is there's a lot of like well-respected organizations. I mentioned Gartner and IDC as an example, and there's others that have forecasted what looks like in the marketplace. So you get a clearer understanding that this isn't a OEM-driven approach, but rather a market-driven approach. And then I think having these conversations, like I've had the good benefit where I get involved in a lot of these conversations, and I think the industry has an obligation to be truthful and forthright and provide, most importantly, provide options, right? In my mind, I don't ever like to go in. Let me give you an analogy. You and I go order a Ford, and it's the blue version is not available. We have to wait 3 months for it. We wait 3 months. We go to pick it up, and they say that's $5,000 more.
Yeah. You
and I are probably not going to be very happy.
Right.
Now, if they told us in the beginning,
ahead of time,
that this was going to happen, and oh, by the way, if you choose not to go with the blue, but you may have picked the black, instead of a 6-cylinder, you went with a 4-cylinder, you would get this. You may have some degradation in terms of performance, but it will meet your needs, right? It'll get you through this period. That's much better than finding out when you drive up to the dealership with your old car that you have to pay $5,000 more. And I'm not sure if that's a good analogy or not, but that's kind of the way I think about it.
That's the conversations that should really be happening now, but also not just, with the technology folks, but also all the way up to the budget folks. And I love the concept of thinking about alternatives and not sort of I said I would needed this and therefore, because the world is changing, right? So, give us a kind of a thought on what's it going to look like by the end of 2026. You mentioned the one study that said this is going to certainly be, it's not going to normalize whatever normal becomes until 2028. But is this going to be the worst year? And next year, folks will it'll start to even out and they'll get used to making some of those trade-offs. Well, what's your crystal ball in terms of what's going to happen?
It's just purely Todd's guess. It doesn't have anything to do with my employer or anything else. But what I would say is that it will be with us for all of 26, at least. I don't see it in any way dissipating. I think the real question might be, does the data center build out continue it at the precipitous pace that it is today? If it slows down, then again, simple economics will say that there's more supply and not enough demand, so therefore prices will decrease. And I think that's the wild card in this conversation in terms of what happens more on the data center side. And then I think you have it on the PC side. You still have, according to Microsoft, lots of people that are still on Windows 10 that need to refresh their devices. And so what happens there? Because that's another inflection point. And then we do business in education as an example. And you have all these COVID devices that are beyond economic life. And so all that's happening. So school districts are also facing a really big challenge with regards to how do they navigate through devices that might be 5 years old now at this point, that might be, given the use environment in K-12, might not be in the best shape. So there's no benefit to waiting, number one. Number two is engage the leadership at your OEM, right? These are the best conversations that you can have. I would just tell you in my job, I spend now probably 50 or 60% of my time directly conversing with customers on this. And and almost every conversation starts with, oh my God, you can't raise my price. And then the second conversation is, okay, I get it now. What are our choice points? Yeah. And so find choice points, because I don't know how everyone else operates, But I like to think about A, B, and C. What's my option A? What's option B? What's C? And then I can make an educated decision. But just don't tell me my option is A and it's this much money, because it's going to force me to think differently.
Yeah. No, I think that's such an important point, right? Is that once you get the understanding, then you're willing to accept options. But until you have the understanding, you think, well, is this real? Is it not real? And I think that's really, an important aspect of what to do here. And of course, the other unpredictable thing, Todd, is the AI bubble going to continue? Is it going to burst? Is it going to make its way, into the endpoint devices? So, all of this doesn't actually really consider how fast is the adoption and how much stress is there going to be, not just from businesses, but just even from you and I in our personal lives, in terms of being able to use those cloud services from the AI providers. So it's an exciting time, Todd.
One last thing to think about, right, on the cloud side is agentic AI has really not taken off yet.
Yes.
That's when the magic of AI happens, whether it's in government or industry. And it's also going to require a lot of compute power in order to do agentic AI. So I think there's going to be pressure in the system. I'm a fastidious reader of the Wall Street Journal, and there was an article on agentic AI for private wealth management as an example. So you think about Morgan Stanley, Schwab, Fidelity, all these kind of businesses, and there's going to be tools that can do the majority of work. They say 100%, and I'm not sure I believe that, but a big part of it. But the compute power required to do that is going to be substantive. And so I think we're still in the early stages. And that's why the industry pundits are saying this is going to be a 27 to 28 thing, primarily because of advances in AI, well beyond you and I typing in a prompt in OpenAI.
Yeah. Well, Todd, thank you so much for this conversation. It's been super educational. And, I love the kind of conversation about what, in fact, should we all be thinking about and what should we be doing. So to everybody out there, thanks for listening to GovTech Viewpoints. Be sure to subscribe to the series on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Spotify so you don't miss a single episode. So, Todd, we'll see you again soon for our next episode and our next big issue. Look forward to seeing you then. Thanks, everyone. Talk to you soon.